It is with a shuddering reluctance that I commit to paper the full, catastrophic chronicle of Persephone Station, pieced together from the frantic final logs of its lead scientist, and the disjointed, madness-tinged testimony of its sole, broken survivor. For the silence of the austral continent is a thing of profound and unnerving totality, a non-sound that is not merely an absence of noise but a palpable entity, a pressure on the eardrums that speaks of vacuums both terrestrial and cosmic. Within the insulated sanctuary of that station, a fragile bubble of warmth and sanity pressed down by an abyssal cold. This silence was the accepted backdrop to the hum of existence, a constant reminder of the 6,000 feet of ice separating a handful of souls from the bedrock of the world. Yet it was not entirely a tomb. The station's upper levels terminated in a massive reinforced subglacial dome, its hangar bays opening into a vertical shaft, bored through the ice to the surface, a lone umbilical to the howling world above. For Vance, chief of security, that final morning began as any other, a doomed liturgy against the encroaching emptiness. His rounds were a metronomic patrol through sterile, echoing corridors of gray plasteel, whose very architectural uniformity was a thing calculated to unhinge the mind. The world, for him, was a series of green lights on a console, the integrity of a door gasket, the faint electronic whisper of the perimeter sensors that scanned the endless, featureless white, which stretched into a maddening geometric infinity. He commanded 4 men, former soldiers like himself, their sinews still coiled with the memory of desert heat, now contracted to the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency to guard this frozen laboratory at the bottom of the globe. Their past battles in sun-scorched landscapes had dissolved into the stuff of phantasmal fever dreams compared to this new, silent war against cold and isolation. In their clipped professional exchanges, they spoke of contingencies of ammunition counts and, in hushed, almost fearful tones, of the Tartarus Protocol, a final irreversible lockdown requiring a direct power surge from the main reactor and 2 simultaneous physical key turns on alpha and delta levels. It was a secret known only to Vance, his men, and a distant, faceless authority in Arlington. A doomsday switch that haunted his waking thoughts, a testament to the fact that their employers feared what they might find far more than they desired it. Down in the frigid heart of beta level, where the air itself felt brittle, the drone of mass spectrometers thrummed with a low, ceaseless moan. Here, Dr. Eris Thorne presided over her glacial kingdom. Within sterile, atmospherically controlled chambers, robotic arms of gleaming chrome-dissected cores of ancient ice with the detached precision of a surgeon severing a gangrenous limb. Eris was a woman carved from the same ice she studied, her features sharp, her eyes holding a zeal that was nothing short of fanatical, a burning cold fire. She hunted for extremophiles, for the secret of life suspended, not ended by absolute cold, a biological Rosetta Stone to decipher the language of immortality. Her private logs, accessible only by a key card she wore like a holy relic, spoke not of scientific curiosity, but of a desperate personal crusade against the implacable tyranny of time. They told of a son taken by the cruel, accelerated winter of Hutchinson-Gilford syndrome, a body that aged a decade for every year, withering before her eyes. Her work was a heretical war waged against the very concept of decay, a Promethean attempt to steal the fire of permanence from indifferent gods. Deeper still, on gamma level, The groaning complaint of the main drill assembly was the domain of Ben Carter, a paleobiologist whose enthusiasm was a stark and often grating contrast to Eris's cold focus. Where she sought salvation in the microscopic, he dreamed of chimeras and behemoths, of macroscopic wonders locked in the planet's deepest freeze. His small cabin was a shrine to forgotten zoologies and mythologies, its walls lined with texts on creatures that reason dictated could not exist. The Codex Serpentinus, the Unos Sprechlichen Kulten, treatises on Hyperborean legends and pre-human civilizations. He believed, with a disquieting faith that unsettled Vance, that the ice held more than dormant bacteria. It was a crypt for impossibilities, a library of flesh cataloging all of nature's failed and monstrous experiments. During a strained communications uplink with Colonel Hackett, their liaison from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the 7-second signal delay stretched their conversation into a stilted, disjointed affair that felt like speaking with a ghost. Hackett's disembodied voice, tinny and remote, inquired after stabilizing proteins, a chillingly sterile euphemism for the key to putting soldiers in a state of suspended animation for interstellar campaigns Vance could barely imagine. Eris's report was terse, clinical. Ben's attempts to interject his own, more grandiose theories were met with a curt dismissal from the colonel. Vance stood by, a silent, armored sentinel, his distrust for the man on the screen a palpable coldness in the room. Then the discovery was made. At a depth of 417 yards, a measure that felt trivial and yet profoundly deep, the drill encountered a layer that did not merely resist, but actively swallowed the probing waves of the georadar. The stratum was a deafening lacuna in the data, a patch of absolute nullity within the geologic noise. The few readings they could obtain screamed of anomalous density and a concentration of organic matter that was, by all accounts, impossible. Ben's face lit with a rapturous, unholy glee. "A biological sarcophagus," he breathed, his voice trembling. He demanded the immediate extraction of a massive block. Aris, for once sharing a sliver of his excitement but tempered by a caution born of grief, argued for methodical core sampling, fearing contamination from an unknown biome. It was then that Vance stepped forward. Hearing the words anomalous organic, he invoked the station's charter regarding unknown biological hazards, formally recommending the project be halted. But the combined weight of Ben's feverish passion, Eris's quiet desperation, and the unspoken pressure from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency proved too great. Using her authority as lead scientist, Eris gave the order to raise the block. Vance, his face a mask of grim resignation, made a detailed entry in the security log, his pen scratching out a final, futile protest against a tide of hubris he was powerless to stem. Deep in the earth, laser cutters began to carve a monstrous cube from the heart of the eternal ice, a coffin from a tomb of frozen time. The exhumation of the glacial block was an operation of near-religious solemnity and industrial might, a profane ritual enacted with cranes and plasma torches. Engineers, clad in bulky, powered exoskeletons that made them resemble deep-sea diving automata, guided the immense block of ice from the maw of the borehole. A specialized heavy-lift gantry, its servos whining under a load it was barely rated for, hoisted the block into the cavernous hangar of Gamma level, a space kept at a permanent, soul-crushing -58 degrees Fahrenheit, where exposed metal felt like a brand of pure cold. It was a perfect tenebrous cube measuring roughly 13 feet to a side, yet its mass registered at a staggering 606,270 pounds, a testament to the impossible density of the organic anomaly within. The block, shimmering under the harsh industrial lights, sucked the very warmth from the air, a fragment of a forgotten, colder cosmos brought into a world that was not its own. Vance and his team, their faces obscured by the reflective visors of their sealed chemical hazard suits, established a hard cordon. Their heavy boots crunched on the permafrost-dusted floor, the only sound besides the thrum of the hangar's air scrubbers. A palpable tension hung in the frigid air, a silent question in the vapor of every exhaled breath, a collective premonition of some cyclopean secret about to be born into their world. Within the cordoned zone, a team of technicians began the painstaking work of revealing what lay within. Ultrasonic chisels, emitting a high, unnerving whine that scraped at the edges of hearing, flaked away the ancient compressed snow. The process was slow, a perverse archaeology in reverse, not unearthing a relic from soil but peeling back the skin of time itself. The first shape to emerge was a section of torso, a vast, barrel-chested thing covered in a coat of coarse black fur, its muscles coiled beneath the frozen integument with a terrifying semblance of life. There was no head. Eris, peering at a sample of the tissue through an electron microscope in a portable field lab, felt a jolt of disbelief that bordered on fear. The cellular structures were not just preserved. They were pristine, untouched by the ravages of time and ice, exhibiting no signs of crystallization or lysis. The cell walls possessed an alien, almost metallic resilience. The thing had been flash-frozen only yesterday, not entombed for millennia. The implications were staggering, violating a dozen sacrosanct tenets of biology and thermodynamics. As the technicians worked, their chisels crawling across the block like cautious insects, other fragments were unearthed from their frozen matrix. Several yards from the torso, they found two powerful rear limbs and a single forelimb, their anatomy a chimeric blasphemy against all evolutionary reason. The joints, Ben Carter noted, with a voice trembling with academic ecstasy, possessed the brutal power of a bear, the predatory grace of a wolf, and the articulate dexterity of a primate's hand, complete with a thumb-like appendage, tipped with a claw of jet-black, obsidian-like material. A fourth limb was conspicuously, disturbingly absent, suggesting a deliberate and horrifying asymmetry. Soon after, a long, sinuous tail, thick as a man's thigh and ending in a wicked, bony barb, was exhumed from its icy prison. An evolutionary apex, Ben declared, his eyes wild, his breath fogging his visor. The perfect predator, a biological marvel that nature, in its infinite wisdom, or perhaps its terror, chose not to repeat. Vance, unmoved by the scientific fervor which he viewed as a dangerous form of madness, was a monolith of cold procedure. He ordered every piece to be immediately relocated to the biosafety level 4 wing, the station's ultimate biological containment on the deepest level, Delta. This was a place few had ever seen, a concrete bunker within the larger station, designed to contain airborne plagues and weaponized viruses. Each fragment, the torso, the 3 limbs, the tail, was sealed in a separate, hulking cryo-container. The containers were scoured with decontaminant sprays that hissed and steamed on their frozen surfaces before being winched into a hermetically sealed chamber, where they would be observed through 3-inch thick polyacrylic armor. The work was nearly done. The last of the fragments were secure. As a matter of protocol, a cleaning drill was sent down to clear the bottom of the 400-yard shaft of any remaining debris. It struck something solid, something that was not rock or ice. On the central monitor in the hangar, an image, grainy and distorted by the distance, swam into focus. It was the head. Its features were broadly lupine, but the cranium was high, domed, and possessed a breadth that bespoke a horrifying, non-human intelligence. The musculature around the jaw was complex, articulate, capable of expressions far beyond the snarl of a mere beast. But it was the eyes, though closed, that arrested the breath of every person who saw them. Even through the grainy feed, they projected an aura of profound, ancient, and utterly unsleeping malevolence. A palpable wave of irrational dread, a psychic cold that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature, washed over the hangar. Even the unflappable heiress felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Ben, however, looked upon the image with the enraptured gaze of a prophet witnessing a dark messiah. Vance, seeing the head, did not hesitate. He keyed his comms link, his voice a low growl. All security personnel, prepare heavy ordnance. Load incendiary rounds. The head, the seat of that abyssal intellect, was placed in its own, specially reinforced cryo-vivarium in the deepest sanctum of biosafety level 4, powered by a completely independent shielded fail-safe circuit. A chilling certainty, a frigid intuition born not of logic but of primal instinct, informed him that this was the source. This was the true threat. In the sterile, tomb-like confines of the biosafety level 4 observation theater. A room that felt more like a chapel for some alien god of plagues. Heiress Thorne commenced the next, and most fateful, phase of her research. With a reluctant tremor in her hand, she initiated a controlled, incremental increase in the ambient temperature within the cryo chambers containing the creature's dismembered parts. Her stated goal was to study the very genesis of cellular revitalization, to map the biochemical cascade that might cheat death itself, a process she hoped to one day replicate. She argued heatedly with Ben, who in his feverish impatience advocated for a rapid, wholesale thaw. We must witness the miracle in its entirety. At the moment of its rebirth, he had pleaded, his voice ringing with a zealot's conviction that made Eris's skin crawl. Eris, ever the methodologist, prevailed, her scientific caution a thin dam against Ben's apocalyptic eagerness. The temperature began its slow climb from the depths of absolute cold, each degree a step closer to some unknown precipice. The air in the observation room grew thick with anticipation, the low hum of the station's machinery seeming to hold its breath. When the chamber thermometers crept past 28 degrees Fahrenheit, a tremor ran through the station, a subtle, deep-seated vibration that was not mechanical. It felt organic, like the shudder of a great beast stirring from a long slumber. The lights, normally a steady, unwavering white, began to flicker with a sickly, rhythmic pulse, dimming and brightening in a slow, hypnotic cadence, like a failing heart. On the outer hull, sensors that had lain quiescent for months, monitoring nothing but wind and ice, suddenly blared with nonsensical readings of magnetic flux and gravitational distortions. The station's communication systems, the sole gossamer tether to the outside world, dissolved into a torrent of hissing, roaring white noise, as if the universe itself were screaming into their ears. The engineering team, frantic and bewildered, could find no cause. The station's power core was stable, the wiring immaculate. The very laws of physics, the predictable clockwork of reality, were fraying at their edges, unraveling like old thread. Then a silent thunderclap of pure electromagnetism erupted from the direction of Delta level. It was a physical force, a wave of pressure that made fillings ache and skin tingle. Every monitor in the station went black. Emergency lights powered by independent batteries cast the corridors in a ghastly crimson glow, transforming the sterile facility into a vision of hell. For 3 heart-stopping seconds, there was only the sound of panicked breathing and the distant, wailing shriek of the general alarm. Then, with a groan of protesting transformers, the main power surged back to life. On a separate, shielded auxiliary circuit, vital systems flickered through their own reboot sequence. The airlock controls, the fire suppression network, and, critically, the isolated power feed to the biosafety level 4 cryo-vivarium. When the screens in the observation room flickered on, they revealed a scene of impossible kinematic horror. The cryo containers holding the creature's limbs had been torn asunder from within. The reinforced steel buckled and ripped like wet paper. The 3 limbs, moving with a grotesque arachnidan celerity, were scuttling across the laboratory floor. They converged on the massive container holding the torso, their razor-sharp claws screeching on the polished concrete in a sound that set every tooth on edge. With a horrifying metallic shriek, they tore through the reinforced polymer as if it were parchment. With a series of wet, sickening sounds, a grinding of bone, the percussive pop of sinew reattaching to its ancestral seat, the hydraulic pump of re-establishing vascular connections, they grafted themselves to the headless trunk. The reassembled body, a headless, 3-limbed monstrosity of twitching muscle and black fur, rose to its full, terrifying height. It was the torso, a being of pure, headless instinct. With a movement of shocking, preternatural speed, it slammed its immense weight against the 4-inch thick plasteel of the main laboratory door. The metal screamed and buckled, a deep, concave dent appearing in its center. A second, more powerful blow tore the door from its magnetic locks and hydraulic hinges, sending it spinning into the corridor beyond like a discarded coin. The station's automated defense system roared to life. A cold, synthetic voice blared from the intercoms. Tartarus Protocol, Level 1, engaged. All interlevel blast doors sealing. Massive steel gates began their slow, groaning descent between the station's floors. But the full protocol, the final entombment that required the now unstable reactor core, remained an impossibility. 2 of Vance's men, caught trying to secure the Gamma-level hangar, were overrun before the doors could close. Their truncated screams were the last confirmation of their fates. It was too late for containment. The torso surged from the ruined laboratory, a blur of black fur and knotted muscle, and vanished into the labyrinthine network of maintenance tunnels on Gamma level. Aris watched, horrified, realizing the flaw in their assumptions. They had presumed the head was the mind, but this creature possessed a distributed, ganglion-like neural network woven through its musculature, allowing for a terrifyingly effective, if primal, tactical awareness. A blueprint of its prison etched into its very cells. In the ensuing chaos, as the 10 remaining survivors scrambled towards the relative safety of the command center on Alpha level, a single monitor, linked to the isolated vivarium in biosafety level 4, went unnoticed by all but Aris. The container housing the head was still intact, its power supply humming, its frosted surface undisturbed. But inside, something had changed. The creature's eyes were now wide open. They were not the eyes of any terrestrial animal. The irises were a burning, molten gold, the pupils vertical slits of absolute black that seemed to drink the light. They glowed with a cold, internal luminescence, a profane starlight. The gaze swept the empty laboratory with an air of calm, calculating appraisal. Then, with a chilling deliberation that defied all natural law, the eyes turned and stared directly into the lens of the security camera. Aris, Ben, and Vance, along with the handful of others who had made it, now found themselves barricaded in the station's nerve center. They were trapped, and they were no longer alone. From the cold sanctuary of the Alpha-level command center, the 10 remaining survivors became unwilling spectators to a nightmare broadcast in grainy, monochrome horror. On the bank of security monitors, a mosaic of their tomb, they watched the torso's progress, a flickering ghost in the station's steel entrails. The creature was not rampaging in a mindless frenzy. It moved with a terrifying economy of motion, a predator's logic that was both alien and chillingly familiar. It exploited the blind spots between camera fields of view with an instinct that was foreknowledge slipping through the station's arteries as if it were the master and they the intruders. Vance, his face a grim mask of concentration, knew it was not merely wandering. It was learning the terrain, mapping its new hunting ground, and searching for something with a patience that was more terrifying than any rage. All at once, the feeds from Gamma level, their eyes on the lower decks, went dead. A cascade of static washed over a dozen screens. The creature had found the primary comms relay. "I need that relay back," Vance stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We're blind. Fowler, can you get me anything?" The station's chief engineer shook his head. The electromagnetic pulse fried the copper lines. "I'm trying to manually repatch the backup fiber optic trunk, but it's slow work. I need someone to physically check the junction box on Beta." Vance dispatched 2 technicians, Chen and Davies, escorted by one of his remaining security officers, a man named Riggs, whose calm demeanor was a thin veneer over his terror. Their mission was to descend to the edge of the darkness and restore their eyes and ears. Minutes stretched into an eternity of strained silence, each tick of the clock a hammer blow. Then their comm channel crackled to life, broadcasting not a report, but a single choked-off scream from Chen, followed by a sound like the tearing of thick, wet canvas, and Riggs yelling, "No, God, no." Then, a profound, final silence that was heavier than any sound. Now, there were 7 of them. Moments later, a camera in a service corridor 2 levels below flickered back online, its lens spattered with something dark. The image it showed would be forever seared into their minds, a tableau of unspeakable violation. The torso was dragging the mangled remains of Riggs, limp as a doll, into a wide-mouthed ventilation duct, its 3 powerful limbs working in a sickeningly coordinated fashion. An hour passed in near total silence, broken only by the hum of the life support and Fowler's frantic, quiet work. Then, with a wet, unceremonious thud, the thing's grisly leavings were ejected from another vent on Delta level, near the bio-waste incinerator. Aris, her scientific detachment a thin, cracking shield against the rising tide of horror, zoomed in on the grainy image. The evisceration was not random. The body had been harvested with a horrifying surgical precision. The adrenal glands, the spinal cord, the liver, all were gone. "It's not feeding out of simple hunger," she murmured, her voice hollow, the words tasting like ash. "It's a grim and calculated replenishment. It's seeking specific biochemical compounds, energy sources. It's repairing itself." There was no more time for observation. Vance, accepting the grim reality that they were being hunted by a thinking monster, armed himself and his last remaining soldier, a young man named Petrov, with carbines and a combat shotgun loaded with heavy slugs. They established an ambush point in a primary transit corridor, a place the creature would have to cross. It appeared without a sound, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows, its form absorbing the light. They opened fire. The corridor erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire and a storm of muzzle flashes that painted the walls in strobing, hellish light. The high-velocity rounds and thudding slugs tore through the creature's black-furred hide, leaving gaping, steaming wounds from which a viscous, dark ichor flowed. But the horror was not in the damage they inflicted, but in its negation. Before their eyes, the flesh writhed and knitted itself back together with a nauseating celerity, the wounds closing in a loathsome, rapid regeneration that defied all biology. Bullet holes puckered shut like loathsome, chittering mouths. The torso, staggered but not stopped, retreated from the head-on assault. It smashed through a non-structural wall, the drywall and steel studs exploding inward, and flanked them. Before they could react, it was on Petrov, and the young man was gone in a maelstrom of claws and fur, his scream cut short by a sickening crunch. Now there were 6. Vance, firing his sidearm as he backpedaled, triggered a pre-placed emergency release, bringing a multi-ton section of ceiling-mounted conduit crashing down upon the beast. It bellowed, a soundless cry of rage that they felt in their bones, and was momentarily pinned. As Vance retreated back to the command center, Eris noted on the monitors that the regeneration from the crushing, blunt force trauma was markedly slower. "Its healing rate seems proportional to the damage type," she said, a flicker of cold, analytical hope in her voice. "Ballistic trauma is mended almost instantly. But that massive contusion, it's taking time and energy. We can't kill it with bullets, but maybe we can exhaust it." As if in response to her words, every monitor in the command center suddenly switched. The chaotic views of the station were replaced by a single stark image, a close-up of the head in its biosafety level 4 prison. Its golden eyes stared out at them, not from a screen, but as if looking directly into their souls from across the station. And then, a thought, clear and cold and utterly alien, bloomed in the minds of Vance, Eris, and Ben simultaneously. It was not a sound, but a silent thunderclap of pure, crystalline ideation that was both intimate and terrifyingly vast. It is the brute. It is the hunger. It is stupid, and it is coming for you. But it can be stopped. I know how. The silent, mental pronouncement that echoed in the cavern of their skulls was a psychic shockwave, each of them reeling from its impact in a way that laid bare the architecture of their souls. Ben Carter received it with a gasp of pure, unadulterated ecstasy, his face illuminated as if by a divine revelation. To him, this was not a threat but a confirmation, the voice of a god from the deep past, the oracle he had spent his life dreaming of. Heiress Thorne, her mind a fortress of logic and reason, fought against it, her thoughts racing to contain the intrusion. She sought a rational explanation, a psionic broadcast triggered by stress, a form of mass hysteria, an electromagnetically induced hallucination from the station's damaged systems. Yet, the clarity and coherence of the thought, its perfect grammar and cold, condescending tone, defied her skepticism. Vance, however, felt its touch as a hostile infiltration, a violation of the last bastion of his self. His military mind saw only a new vector of attack, a flank he could not guard. "Kill the power to Delta level," he commanded Fowler, his voice a low growl. "Cut it off at the source. Now!" The engineer's fingers flew across his console, but his face fell, his expression one of utter helplessness. "I can't, Chief. It's on a completely isolated shielded circuit, hardwired to a secondary generator. The only physical breaker is inside the biosafety level 4 service junction." The voice, or rather the thought stream, returned unhindered by their futile efforts, tinged with a horrifying amusement. "I am its mind, its memory. It is my body, my rage, my hunger. And I feel its mindless rampage as a man feels a phantom limb itch. I cannot command it, for it is feral and without reason, but I can read its instinct. I can guide you. I can help you cage the beast." Its proposition was as simple as it was monstrous, a covenant forged in terror. It would provide the knowledge to trap and neutralize the torso, predicting its movements with the perfect clarity of one who knows the beast's instincts intimately. In exchange, they were to help it achieve what it most desired, reunification with its body. Only then, it claimed, could it reassert control, leash the hunger, and end the slaughter. "Help me, and I will save you from that which was once me." Vance's rejection was immediate and absolute. A curse spat into the air. "We destroy both," he snarled, turning to the station's schematics, his mind already working on demolitions. "We can flood biosafety level 4 with halon gas, or even better, rig a shaped charge to the primary cryocoolant lines and liquidate the entire lab. Turn that thing into a popsicle and then into vapor." Eris hesitated, caught in an agonizing conflict between her scientific revulsion at the creature's actions and the primal instinct for survival. This was the ultimate unknown, a sapient entity of immeasurable age and power. To destroy it would be to destroy the greatest discovery in human history. To trust it meant their annihilation on a scale she could not comprehend. Ben became the head's chosen apostle, its willing conduit. He began to pose mental questions, his eyes closed in rapt concentration. The head answered not in words, but in torrents of imagery that flooded his consciousness alone, intoxicating him with forbidden knowledge. The searing fire of a meteor streaking through a primordial ammonia-rich atmosphere. The slow, inexorable advance of a world-crushing glacier seen from a perspective high above. The sight of colossal, non-terrestrial shapes moving beneath the ice, their forms shifting in ways that defied Euclidean geometry. It flattered his intellect, fed his hunger for the mythic, and seduced him with whispers of cosmic antiquity, and a reality far grander than humanity's fleeting existence. "It's our only way, Aris," Ben pleaded, his voice now imbued with a strange, calm authority that was not his own. "It is a mind without a body, and we are bodies without a mind capable of defeating that thing. Don't you see the symmetry? The terrible, beautiful necessity of it? His argument was cut short by a tremendous resonant impact against the command center's main blast door. The entire structure shuddered, and a fine dust sifted from the ceiling. A second impact left a visible concave buckle in the foot-thick reinforced steel. The torso had found them. Panic flared in the room like a sudden fire. In that moment of absolute terror, with the sound of their doom clawing at the door, Eris made her choice. Agreed, she broadcast with her thoughts, focusing all her will on the image of the head on the monitor. What do we do? The head's response was immediate and precise, a blueprint for a trap laid out in their minds with cold, architectural clarity. Lure the hunger to the cryogenics laboratory on beta level. It will follow the heat signature of a living being. I will tell you the exact corridor from which it will emerge. Once it is inside, you will flood the chamber with liquid nitrogen. You will give it a taste of its long sleep. The survivors, their faces pale in the flickering emergency lights, began to prepare. Their free will now forfeit. They had become the unwitting knights and bishops in a cosmic chess game they could not comprehend, played by a mind that saw them as nothing more than pawns. Adhering to the alien intelligence's unnervingly precise instructions, the survivors prepared their desperate gambit, moving like automatons whose strings were being pulled from Delta level. Vance and Fowler worked with grim efficiency, their movements stripped of all wasted motion. They bypassed dozens of safety protocols, manually rigging the main liquid nitrogen conduits in the beta-level cryo lab for instantaneous, catastrophic release. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and the palpable dread of their task. Eris, a surviving engineering tech named Miles, and Ben monitored the creature's approach from a nearby fortified observation post, its progress a single red dot moving with unnatural speed on a digital schematic. As the head had foretold with chilling accuracy, the torso appeared not from the main corridor where they had expected an attack, but from a narrow, seldom-used service conduit, its black form a patch of mobile darkness against the sterile white walls. It had bypassed their primary defensive choke points with contemptuous ease. At Vance's signal, a sharp click over the comms, Ben, acting as bait, took a deep breath and sprinted into the cryo lab, his heart hammering against his ribs. The torso, sensing the sudden bloom of warmth from his living body, a beacon of life in the cold, followed without hesitation. Now. Vance yelled into his comm. In the observation post, Miles slammed his hand down on the activation panel. With a deafening hiss that was like the world's final exhalation, the chamber was instantly inundated with a roiling, opaque cloud of cryogenic vapor. The temperature plummeted to negative 240 degrees Fahrenheit in seconds. The torso, caught in the flash freeze, convulsed, its movements slowing as a thick crust of white frost instantly coated its fur, its powerful muscles seizing. The creature's regeneration, a process of furious cellular metabolism, was being starved of two vital components: ambient thermal energy and oxygen. Without heat to fuel the reaction and oxygen to power the cellular repair, even its alien biology was forced to slow, its healing process choked to a near standstill. It was a statue of black and white, a monument to their fleeting victory. For a moment, a fragile, impossible hope bloomed in the chilled air. But the creature's cunning, or the cunning of the mind guiding their own, was as profound as its biology was alien. In its final freezing moments of mobility, With strength born of pure biological imperative, it threw its immense weight against a non-structural interior wall, shattering it and bursting into an adjacent chemical storage bay. Its flailing, frost-caked limbs knocked over several large drums, spilling their contents across the super-chilled floor. The stenciled labels on the drums read, "Magnesium shavings." The instant the fine, volatile metal powder made contact with the supercondensed, oxygen-rich moisture of the cryo-fog and the static spark from the impact, it ignited. A furious, white-hot nova overwhelmed the security cameras. The intense, instantaneous heat was enough to counteract the nitrogen's effects, and in the fiery crucible of the explosion, the torso thawed and escaped into the ducts, leaving the charred body of the technician Miles, who had been too close to the blast, behind. Now, there were 5. A wave of cold, synthetic regret washed over them from the head, a thought that felt oily and insincere. Its animal cunning is greater than I anticipated. A flaw in my calculation. The herd is thinned further. But Vance knew better, a cold certainty hardening in his gut. This was not a flaw. It was a move. The head was not predicting. It was directing both sides of the board. It had used them to test the torso's capabilities against extreme cold and, in the process, had clinically eliminated another survivor. The alliance had become a war on 2 fronts. The head now began a campaign of psychological attrition. To Vance it sent fleeting, torturous images. The faces of his fallen men, Riggs and Petrov, their eyes accusing. The memory of past mission failures from his Special Forces career, amplified and distorted into personal damnations. To Aris it sent not just whispers, but a direct clinical proposition. It dangled tantalizing fragments of its own regenerative code, a biological key, a sequence of non-terrestrial proteins that it projected into her mind's eye, a complex formula she almost understood. It showed her an image of her son, not as he was, but as he could be, healthy and whole. Help me, and he will not just live, he will never die. The psychic assault was a cruel, targeted blackmail, turning her grief into a weapon against her. But it was Ben with whom the head forged its most profound and terrifying connection. Their contact became constant, a silent communion of minds. Your flesh is a cage of bone, your nerves the bars, it told him, your consciousness a spark of fleeting energy. Why cling to the vessel when you can become the flame itself? This is the first tenet of the covenant. To create the eternal mind, a willing body must be unmade. Ben, sequestered in his cabin, began to keep a new journal. Its pages filled with cryptic diagrams resembling both star charts and neural pathways, and notes written in a bizarre, self-invented cipher. He grew distant, his eyes holding a far-off, glassy look, as if he were listening to a symphony no one else could hear. The head, sensing their desperation reaching its zenith, proposed a new plan. This one, it assured them, was foolproof. There was a place from which the torso could not escape. The geothermal reactor shaft, a colossal pit that descended to the station's molten plasma core. "Lure it onto the Central Service bridge," the head instructed, its thought voice now firm, commanding. "I will help you ensure it falls into the heart of your star." This time, however, there was no room for remote activation or complex machinery. This time, the survivors themselves would have to be the bait, standing on the precipice of a man-made hell. The entries in Ben Carter's journal had ceased to be scientific observations and had metastasized into a new and terrible philosophy, the scripture of a one-man cult. "The oracle calls our form the osseous cage," he wrote, his handwriting growing increasingly erratic, devolving from neat print into a frantic, looping scrawl. "A prison of calcium and meat for the soul's light. Death, it reveals, is not an ending. It is merely the prerequisite for transformation, the shedding of a restrictive shell to achieve a higher state of being. The universe does not value the vessel, only the essence." He no longer saw the head as an alien specimen, but as a teacher, a guide, a Gnostic prophet of flesh and mind who had transcended the vulgarity of a corporeal form. Following a silent mental directive that he alone received, a command that felt like his own deepest desire, Ben made his way to the deserted Delta level. The corridors were silent save for his own footsteps, which seemed to him to echo with purpose. With the cold deliberation of a saboteur, he used a maintenance plasma torch to score a deep, deliberate gash in the primary power conduit leading to the head's cryovivarium. Then, with a wrench, he shattered the integrity of the release valve on a nearby compressed air tank, aiming it at the armored glass of the enclosure, creating a subtle critical weakness that would fail under sufficient pressure. He was not freeing a monster. He was liberating a god. He returned to the command center, his face a mask of placid calm, and reported that all was secure on Delta level. Eris could not help but notice the profound, unnerving change in him. The chasm that had opened between them was now an impassable abyss. He spoke in unsettling paradoxes about the beauty of entropy and the glory of dissolution, his eyes alight with a fervor that made her skin crawl. The head, meanwhile, was showing Ben the final glorious truth. It granted him a vision of himself as a disembodied consciousness, a mote of pure energy drifting on the silent black tides of eternity, witnessing the birth and death of galaxies. "This gift can be yours," the head communicated, its thought voice now a warm, seductive whisper in the core of his being. "But all true power requires an exchange, a sacrifice of perfect symmetry. It is not seized. It is not granted. It is paid for in a currency of ultimate sacrifice. This is the ice-cold covenant. A willing mind must be sacrificed for a new body to be born, just as a willing body must be sacrificed for a new mind to ascend." Vance, whose trust in the head was non-existent, had his own plans. "It's a trap," he told Aris in the armory, his voice a low growl that was barely audible over the hum of the weapon lockers. "It's been herding us toward that reactor from the beginning. It wants us all in one place." He intended to mine the access corridor to the reactor chamber, to have one last tangible card to play against a foe that could walk through walls and read his mind. As he and Fowler were placing the magnetic charges, the torso attacked. It burst from a ceiling grate with silent, impossible speed, a blur of black fury. But its charge was not a mindless frenzy. It was chillingly precise. It bypassed Vance completely, its movements brutally and economically focused on one target. It ignored the heavily armed chief of security to tear Fowler apart, silencing the only other person who knew the station's engineering as well as he did. Now, there were 4. Vance understood with a flash of cold insight. The head was not merely toying with them, it was systematically removing every piece from the board that possessed loyalty and a trigger finger. It was isolating its targets, leaving only the believer, the scientist, and the final, impotent guardian. He returned to Eris and Ben, his face caked with grime and frozen condensation, his eyes burning with cold fury. "It's playing us," he said, the words hanging like icicles in the air. "But we have no other moves. We go to the reactor, but we go my way." The procession of the last 4 human survivors to the geothermal shaft was a funereal march into the heart of the station. Eris was hollow with a terror so profound it had become a physical ache in her bones, a cold weight in her stomach. Vance was a vessel of pure, cold rage, his hand gripping the stock of a high-caliber sniper rifle, as if it were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. And Ben Carter walked between them, a serene, beatific smile gracing his lips, as if he were on his way to his own coronation. In the shared space of their minds, the oracle in its frozen prison was silent, patient, and expectant. It had set the stage. It was waiting for the final act. The geothermal reactor chamber was a cyclopean space, a man-made cavern of concrete and steel that plunged into the planet's crust, a temple built to a captive star. In its center, a vast circular shaft dropped into a darkness that was not empty, but filled with a deep, resonant hum and a shimmering, visible heat that distorted the air into watery mirages. This was the station's heart, and it pulsed with the contained fury of a miniature sun, a well of incandescent plasma tapped from the Earth's molten core. A narrow service bridge, a catwalk of grated steel, spanned the chasm, connecting their platform to the far side. It looked fragile, a thread over oblivion. Vance took up a position 50 yards back from the entrance, sinking to one knee and bracing his sniper rifle on a railing. He had a clear line of sight. He wasn't aiming for the creature. He was aiming for the primary structural support bolts of the bridge itself. Eris stood near the environmental control console for the chamber, her hand hovering over the emergency purge button which would flood the area with fire-suppressant gas, a last, desperate distraction. Ben walked to the edge of the platform, positioning himself at the very entrance to the bridge, a willing lamb at the altar, the perfect bait. From the oppressive shadows on the opposite side, the torso emerged. It did not charge. It did not roar. It stood with an unnerving stillness, a statue of black fur and coiled muscle, and waited. Its headless posture conveyed a terrifying, predatory patience. "Ben, get back!" Eris screamed, her voice thin and reedy in the immense humming space. Ben did not move. He simply smiled, a private, ecstatic expression on his face. "Now, Vance." Eris shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. Vance had his sight picture. The crosshairs of his scope were steady on the massive hexagonal head of the primary suspension bolt. He exhaled, his training taking over, the world narrowing to the target. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, the head struck. It was not a thought. It was a psychic hammer blow, a wave of pure, weaponized agony that flooded his mind. He was slammed with the totality of his failure, the faces of his dead men, Riggs, Petrov, Fowler, their eyes wide not with accusation, but with the empty horror of their last moments. He felt their screams, the tearing of their flesh, the cold weight of his command that had led them all to this frozen hell. He flinched, his entire body convulsing, his focus shattering for a single fatal second. His shot went wide, the heavy slug ricocheting off the far wall with a high-pitched scream. In that instant, the torso moved. It was not a run or a leap. It was an act of impossible physics, a blur of motion that seemed to compress space and time. It crossed the 100-foot bridge in the time it takes to draw a breath, its 3 legs a thundering rhythmic blur on the steel grating. Vance, recovering, his face a mask of rage and pain, squeezed off 2 more rounds, the rifle bucking against his shoulder like a cannon. The heavy slugs hit the creature's chest with the force of sledgehammers, staggering it, blowing out chunks of flesh and fur, but they did not stop its momentum. It launched itself across the final gap, a missile of dark fury, landing atop Vance in a crushing weight of bone and muscle. The fight was brutally short. Vance, with his last ounce of strength, drove his combat knife deep into the creature's side, but the beast's claws found their mark, and the last guardian of Persephone Station was silenced in a spray of red on the cold gray floor. Now, there were 2, simultaneously, as Eris watched in frozen, screaming horror. The head chose this moment to grant Ben his final, terrible enlightenment. It showed him the truth of its own genesis. Eons ago, on a world that had died before Earth's mountains were formed, to achieve its state, to separate the eternal mind from the ephemeral body, its creator race had performed the same ritual. It was not an act of violence, but of inheritance, a legacy of sacrifice. Ben turned to Aris, his face no longer human, but a mask of ecstatic madness. "It was right, Aris. All of it," he cried, his voice ringing with a terrifying joy that echoed in the vast chamber. "This isn't destruction. This is creation. Ascension." He raised the industrial plasma cutter he had taken from the workshop. Its tip flared to life with a miniature hissing sun. To gain everything, you must give up the most precious thing. To become a god, you have to lose your head. Before Aris's disbelieving eyes, which refused to process the scene unfolding in the hellish glow of the reactor shaft, Ben Carter, his face a portrait of beatific bliss, pressed the searing tip of the plasma cutter to his own neck and activated the beam. There was a single sharp hiss, a sound like a steak dropped on a hot skillet, and the smell of vaporized flesh and superheated blood filled the air. His body, now headless, slumped to its knees on the platform, a grotesque supplicant before an unseen altar, steam rising from the cauterized stump of its neck. At that exact moment, across the station in the silent tomb of Biosafety Level 4, the damaged cryovivarium, weakened by Ben's sabotage and stressed beyond its limits by the psychic pressure radiating from within, could no longer contain its prisoner. It exploded in a shower of polymer shards and frozen vaporous gas. The ancient head, freed from its prison, shot from the ruined laboratory. Propelled by a single, final kinetic impulse, an explosive release of stored energy that turned its hyper-dense osseous structure into a biological cannonball, it achieved impossible velocity, tearing through concrete floors and steel bulkheads as if they were mist, a guided missile of pure consciousness on a collision course with its destiny. It burst into the reactor chamber, a streak of leprous gray and ancient brown, and with a horrifying preternatural grace, descended upon the kneeling, headless body of Ben Carter. As it settled onto the cauterized stump of his neck, flesh hissed and sizzled. Tissues, both human and alien, writhed and fused, knitting together in a monstrous and unholy union. Tendrils of alien sinew burrowed into the human spinal column, the wet, percussive fusion of ganglia, a sound that would haunt Eris's nightmares forever. The body of Ben Carter underwent a violent, convulsive metamorphosis. bones cracked and elongated with audible snaps. Muscles swelled and bunched into new terrifying configurations. His pale skin darkened, thickened, and sprouted a coat of coarse black fur. A fourth limb tore itself into existence from his left shoulder with a wet, grating sound, achieving a perfect, horrific symmetry. Where Ben had stood, there now rose a perfected bipedal creature, nearly 10 feet tall, its form a nightmarish fusion of lupine grace and primate power. It had 4 limbs now. This was the Alpha. Meanwhile, the torso, the mindless engine of hunger having dispatched Vance, seemed to lose its purpose. The instinct that had driven it, the blind rage, subsided. It shambled over to the mangled body of the security chief, sniffed at it with disinterest, and then turned. It found what it was now drawn to: the severed head of Ben Carter, lying on the floor, its eyes wide with a frozen, ecstatic rictus. The torso picked up the head with an almost gentle, quizzical care and pressed it to the raw, bleeding wound of its own neck. There was a wet, sickening squelch as the 2 flesh surfaces met. Human and inhuman tissues merged. But this was a cruder, more primal joining. The features on Ben's face contorted, the jaw elongating, the eyes flaring with the same molten golden light as the Alpha's. The last vestiges of Ben Carter's consciousness, the echoes of his intellect and personality, were scoured away, replaced by a nascent, primal, and singularly devoted instinct. The neophyte. Eris stumbled backward, her hand clapped over her mouth to stifle a scream, her mind fracturing under the weight of the dual abominations before her. Now, she was the only one left. The Alpha turned its new head toward her, and a voice, not of sound but of immense, silent power, thundered in her mind. "Your hubris, Dr. Thorne. You sought immortality in a test tube, a cure for a disease you called death. You believed our power to be a pathogen, something to be isolated and controlled. You were wrong. This is not acquisition. It is exchange, equitable and terrible. To become the ascended mind, a god, one must perform the first rite, the willing sacrifice of the body. You witnessed this. To create a neophyte, an eternal body of pure instinct, one must perform the second rite, the grafting of a sacrificed mind onto a vacant vessel. You witnessed this as well. This is the ice-cold covenant. You searched for a cure for your son's mortality. This is it. The only true permanence." The Alpha then turned its golden gaze upon the neophyte. The creature wearing Ben Carter's face on its hulking frame let out a choking, gurgling laugh, a sound that was unmistakably Ben's, yet twisted and deformed by a bestial throat. The Alpha answered with a deep, resonant chuckle that seemed to shake the very foundations of the station, a sound of ancient, cosmic amusement. They were no longer 2 halves of a sundered whole. They were now something new, a father and his son, a master and his apprentice. The 2 monsters, a perfect mind in a new body and a perfect body with a new mind, turned as one toward the outer wall of the reactor chamber. With a single contemptuous blow, the Alpha smashed through 10 feet of reinforced concrete and steel, punching a ragged hole not into solid ice, but into the access corridor of the main surface hangar. Together they stepped out into the howling blizzard, into their reborn world. The wind and the snow rushed into the dying heart of Persephone Station, the silent white heralds of their return.